Good afternoon, everyone. I'm still a morning person. I'm afternoon, but I'm not going to make you go to a certain level. Welcome back. I know we're not all here. Hopefully everybody online is back, but we need to continue on because my experience is our presenters need all the time that they can get. Okay, so once again, we have Lisa Liggett and Aaron Kitchell. I'm not sure if it's going to go exactly in that order, but we're going to turn it back over to them. We've already had their bios haven't changed since our last session, so we're going to stay with that. And anything more they want to say in terms of introductory remarks, I'll give it back to them. I just want to remind you, those of us that are beyond the first three rows, if you could kind of give me a little head start to get the microphone to you so that the individuals online can hear you. As you can tell, it's not amplifying my voice here, but it is helping those who are online to hear what is said so that they can gain some questions and comments as well. Without further ado, Lisa, over you.
Hello again. The only change to the bio that I would add is that I am a yoga teacher. And so during the session, I want you to kind of identify what honey badger parts of your body might be hurting. And so before the fourth session, we'll just do a little stretch at the end of this one, just so you feel better. So sitting down for a long time, that's not good for you. This is not good for you. So we will re-energize at some point and make sure that you are just as excited about the fourth one as the first. So we're going to talk about addressing common violations because as much as you're experts in your discipline, this is what we hope you never have to do. But the amount of stress associated with it, if you're not prepared compared to if you're sitting here, is worlds apart. And much of it is not as, I think, intimidating as we first present. So what are outcomes for this one? Identifying what the common misconduct trends are so that you're clear on the code, and then looking at how do you respond to those common violations so that it is as non-confrontational as possible, especially because it doesn't have to be confrontational. And so we wouldn't be doing this job for this long if it was this brutal confrontational, issue every single time. So this is a pivotal quote to why we do what we do. If there's anyone in here that doesn't believe this, I don't believe you, because you wouldn't be in here. We know that this is a cornerstone of why we've chosen the profession that we have. It's important and it's part of how society, at least in the US, operates. We could not go through our daily life without feeling like the people who we are trusting did not cheat to get their way through. You would not go on a bridge. You would not turn on your faucet if there weren't regulators, if there weren't people who you felt like you could trust, because we have these standards. As we know, when we travel to developing countries where these standards don't exist, it's a frightening place. This is a societal norm that we cannot function without. So part of what we're going to review in this session, and part of what you learned that we make this part 3 of, is academic honesty and promoting student learning is about planning, so the prevention component, the maintenance, much like your car, and then the response. The response is the part that we are, in many cases, the personality-wise, the least equipped to do. And so that's why we're going to focus this particular third session on the response. So think back to, I hope not something that inspired you to be here, but perhaps something that has happened in your classroom that maybe first or most recently gave you that feeling. What are some things that you're facing? What's happened?
A fellow master's cohort, I was actually teaching them in class, and they plagiarized one of their lab reports. So they came from a different school, had to take the undergraduate or the dual class, and I was a TA for it, and then they plagiarized. So one of my peers who's in my graduate program is plagiarizing in the class that I teach.
Can you hear that in the back?
No.
He, at the master's level, was teaching some folks who had transferred in public health, which somehow feels even more
It was
offensive.
with undergrads.
With undergrads.
They were taking like the undergraduate level part of that class.
He was teaching an undergraduate level portion of the class, and students in that class who are his peers plagiarized. Sam, can I ask you one probing question? How did that feel?
Honestly, I'm a pretty blunt person when it comes to that, so it did feel kind of weird at first, but then I'm like, well, I just send it off to the instructor of the course and then we dealt with it.
Because what I think that a lot of people don't anticipate feeling when this happens to you is a sense of betrayal. You have put together this assignment with a specific outcome that you're hoping your students get because you care. And then when they don't show what feels like any care back, it feels like a betrayal. And so is it Richard Quinn at UCF? I can't remember. Richard Quinn at UCF realized that a number of students, and I think an engineering course, had cheated on his test. And this is a YouTube video that we use in our academic integrity workshop for students who have been found in violation of the code. And he talks about how sacred this topic is to him and how sacred teaching is and his role in society and how that betrayal has shuttered every part of that. And it is beautiful. And part of why I bring that up too is because a lot of reasons why people are afraid to report is they're afraid that there's going to be some disproportionate consequence. But what we're helping students understand is what it feels like to be on the other side, because the likelihood that the person who was so overwhelmed that they decided to cheat considered your feelings is about this big. And we know that. And we've all been in that position too, where we're so caught up in what our motives are that we're not even thinking about the impact that it has on someone else. What are the other issues that have occurred in your classrooms? Yes, ma'am. Well, Nate'll come over with a microphone.
I'm a pretty loud speaker.
Okay.
One of the things is having an older student in the class.
Mm-hmm.
Having an older student in the class who thinks they know more than the teacher knows.
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to take over the class, it intimidates you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, when I say power struggle, nobody in here is beating their chest like Tarzan power struggle, but there has to be a center of energy, we'll call it, in the classroom. And so when somebody distracts that center of energy, we either want it to be the whole class talking and working on a problem, or we want the center of energy to be right here. And so when somebody takes it off of what is clearly the course, everyone feels disoriented. And there's no way to help people feel oriented until you pull it back. And what you don't want is a power struggle in front of your students under any circumstances. And guess what? If you play into that because you get nervous because all of these eyes are watching you, you only look small. So I think in those situations is when a lot of times it's a one-to-one conversation. And if it isn't a matter of the lack of self-awareness that we have alluded to, then it definitely needs to be addressed one-to-one, and there need to be some behavioral expectations set in place. That's tough. I am so sorry. You had one too.
It's similar to hers. I had a student who, so I teach first year English, and I had a student who was a transfer student who didn't want to do the work and felt like the class wasn't worth his time. And so a lot of his behavior inside the class and outside of the class directed toward me was a distraction from the work that needed to happen, so that I wouldn't know that he didn't actually do the work. And it just kind of, it became this thing that that kind of distracted the entire class. I mean, people knew what was going on, and there were people who covered for him when he didn't come in with the work that he was supposed to have. But at the end of the semester, I realized that it was a performance from beginning to end. That he was hoping that toward the end I would feel sympathy toward him and just pass him. And he did a lot of things to undercut me, including going to my department and going to my supervisor to talk about his concern for my grading and not talking about the fact that he was being graded poorly because he wasn't actually doing the work. So yeah, that was great.
It's concerning that someone can be a master of deflection at 18. I don't know what's behind that. That concerns me too. But I appreciate what you said at the end. I'm going to try to figure out how to say this without sounding really gross. But when there is an academic deficiency accompanying a behavioral problem, you have eliminated a lot of the things that can make you look discriminatory is too complex a word and an issue, but the student is going to, if as a deflection from their underperformance, try to make it look like it's you. And so when you have that academic component and the average is here and they're here consistently, stick to the academic reason for why the grades are occurring and don't get into the other stuff if it's possible. Now that's not always, I don't want to say a luxury, but it's not always that clean. No. And so looking at how do you get into that student's head as far as why what's happening is happening, because there's something else going on that has nothing to do with you. And so figuring out how do I get to that student to determine what's going on outside of you, me, and this class content that's causing this. Because even though some people were covering for him, I guarantee you the majority of the class thought this was completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
So remember, when you're in a class and you would see things happen, you're like, oh. One loud person, and one thing, we feel like it's normative and nobody is speaking up, so people must be accepting it. Not necessarily. More cases than not, the rest of the class is like, gosh, I wish something would happen that would change this dynamic. We have another fun question. I'm sorry that happened to you.
We have two online comments. One issue has been student bringing up a very controversial topic that I wanted to avoid.
And that's going to continue to happen more and more as we know in our political climate. So if you're already in it, you're already knee deep because it's come up. We certainly don't want to give the appearance of squelching those things. So at that point, you've got to trudge forward. That would be a perfect time to set some guidelines in the classroom about how you're going to discuss this topic. So stepping back to say, that's a pretty, volatile thing for us to talk about in this classroom. If it doesn't necessarily align with your learning outcomes, you may be able to back off and find a way for it to align. But if you're already there, then the best thing that you can do is remind people about what academic debate is meant to look like. So in the classroom, in a university, this should be where we're all experts at fostering it, but it is scary as hell, so we're not. That's okay. But what do we want to do? Contextualize how we're going to have the conversation and what we're going to do if somebody goes outside of those boundaries so that you can keep control. Because my guess with the person who's asking the question, you can chime in, is that the concern is that there's about to be a circus or we're about to cause some sort of uproar that we can no longer contain. And that is a very scary scenario because you don't know who your allies in the room are and you don't know who's going to set somebody else off for very deep-seated important reasons to them. So that is scary. So setting up that context, if you're already in it, is, I think, one of your only options.
So the next comment is very much related to one of the things you just said, which was students talking and not stopping even after I requested them to stop.
Everything I need to know I learned in kindergarten, like when the teacher says stop. You stop. There is a time and a place for vulnerability in the classroom. Not unlike Sam's example of saying, learning that you guys cheated, or Professor Quinn's ECS, really, that hurt my feelings because I had expectations that I never thought that you would question. And now I realize that I was naive and that I put faith in you that you didn't return. If people are just being blatantly rude, again, our first assumption is they don't realize it. They're so stuck in their own little worlds. So before we vilify, which when you're up here, it is easy to, feel free to say to them, guys, we have a limited time and I have stuff to cover. But more importantly than that, when I start talking again and you continue to, what are some of the feelings that you would have if that was reversed? And let them start going, disrespectful, rude, and let them know, I don't think you are rude people. I don't think you're disrespectful people. A little self-efficacy can kind of go a long way too. Yes, are you being the bigger person? 100%. Is that ever the wrong decision? Never. You guys aren't this, you aren't this, you aren't this. But that's kind of this dance that we're doing, and it's gonna stop today. We're not doing that anymore. You'll find marriage and family therapists will say this. One person kind of broaches the line, the other person doesn't push back, and then that kind of becomes the rhythm and the dance that you do, and it becomes acceptable until somebody finally goes, I'm sick of this and now I'm pissed off. Well, you've been living with it for a while. Stop it as soon as that dance starts. Turn off the music, let them know why, and there's not a single person in your class who's gonna say, that's unreasonable. If you're being reasonable, which you are, let them know, hey, you're not disrespectful. I feel nothing but lack of any interest in what our course topic is today, and that's hurtful. How do we move forward? Can we all agree that that's not gonna occur anymore? Even better, now you have group buy-in. Who's gonna say no? So it's slightly coercive. But that would be, I think, your best bet, because you can't individually meet with all of them to say, knock it off.
There was one last question, Elisa, about examples of dealing with some of the power struggles, specifically maybe with older adults who feel like they know more. So can you kind of speak to that a little bit? I know you talked a little bit about it, but.
People who get into power struggles sometimes, and this is with your family, friends, pets, it makes you wonder, what are they trying to fill? So do they need the validation? Your contribution is important. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that. Maybe they just need a little bit of that validation of, thank you for that. But let me talk to you after class, because again, it is disorienting for the other members of the class if they feel like you're interrupting me, or your delivery, even though you have good content, sounds like it's trying to one up. So the way you're messaging might be giving off an impression that you're not intending to, and I care about you. I want to be sure that you know that. There's a famous psychologist that used to be director of our counseling center named Russell Haber, and when he would talk to people who were super disruptive or having an issue, he would say, sometimes I'm not sure that you understand how people are experiencing you. Can we think of examples in our life where we're like, I don't think you understand how I'm experiencing you right now. So I think when we remember that in general, people are doing the best that they can, and I firmly believe that, but that doesn't mean they understand how people are experiencing them. So if you care enough, you'll have a difficult conversation about, I don't think you understand how people are experiencing you, especially if people have come to you. And you don't want to shame that person, but letting them know other students, not a lot, a very small group, but once those students care enough to come to me and express that this is what they feel is happening, and that feels disruptive to their ability to get out of the class, or they're looking to get out of the class, I go, she would never want to do that. And I know that. So that's why it's easy for me to come to you and explain this, because I'm sure that's not your intention. There's no way that's someone's intention. unless they're a real crap bag, and most of the time we don't have real crap bags. So great questions, great questions.
One more.
Yeah.
Speaking of older students, I guess, and I probably look a lot younger than I am, and I do a lot of one-on-one work with students that are at professional levels, so a lot of them actually are older than me. What I get is less of like they're talking down to me, but more of they're acting like I'm not their teacher and we're peers. Is there something, some good way to handle that before it gets like too late and then they do something that's clearly inappropriate or something? Like talking about stuff that's just like, wait a second, whoa, we weren't friends.
Will you say,
They're not like, nothing like sexual harassment or anything.
Right.
Just to be clear, just like, I don't know.
They're
start talking
chummy.
about other people or what was that?
Like they're chummy?
Yeah.
Is that where it's, I'm trying to determine exactly what's over the line. Their chumminess with you?
They'll start, I don't know, mentioning things about like, I don't know, just start getting inappropriate or like terminology wise or
Lack of professionalism.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have that too.
Yeah.
So I'm on the same page.
Let's do it.
Regularly.
When I don't know what to do you know what I do? Make it my fault. I am so sorry. I feel uncomfortable when you use that terminology because I have a certain role at the school as an instructor. And so part of my role is to make sure that everybody's on the same, and I don't have a specific example, so I'm not able to give that to you, but act like it's like you're the one who took a misstep. I know you're not, but it's not about convincing them that they are out of line. It's about stopping the behavior at that point. And so if the quickest way to stop the behavior is to say, you know what, I trust you enough to let you know I feel uncomfortable when you talk about that person in that way, because if I have a role in their grade, oh, that's how you go about it. Yeah, we're gonna high five this, work this out. I have a role in their grade, and if anything feels discriminatory, like I'm bringing in any information that's not specifically academic in my, in my evaluation of them, that could lead to problems for me down the road. So I have got to keep this discussion academic. And that's true, you guys. If you have a bad interaction with a student, or you go, oh my gosh, so-and-so cheated in my class, and a student finds that out, you may not have had any malintent in doing that, but once a student feels like your evaluation of them is not based on their academics, you are inviting a whole world of that discrimination scope if they don't feel like they have the grade that they want. So I would try to bring it back to, I have an academic evaluation role, and I can't let anything subvert my integrity in that. I hope, and if you want to call me later with a specific example, I'm frightened for you. Any others? Yes.
Okay, so I was talking with a couple people, and we were just talking, but in generality, I look younger, a lot younger than what I really am.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes students can mistake that. So I don't know if you would correct this, because sometimes my response has been, well, I feel uncomfortable when you address me that way,
Mm-hmm.
or when you say that to me.
Yeah. And that's brilliant, Nate, because it also takes out you trying to one up because you do have the credentials. The likelihood that you're talking to somebody who you out credential is about 100%. So instead of being, oh, credential you, like, gross, hey, I feel uncomfortable when. And then who's going to say, well, you shouldn't feel uncomfortable? Nobody. Yay! Solved. Also, sometimes it's, if you need to tell your class, I've been teaching for 7 years. You don't have to say your age. It's none of their damn business. But when I tell people I've been teaching 20 years, I'm like, I just got some credibility without telling you my age, but you probably wouldn't have predicted 20 years. So now we've accomplished both of those goals. So I hope so. And did you guys know what's the #1 type of discrimination?
Age.
Age. So not that validation is what you want. I didn't realize that until I saw the stats, but we need to confront age discrimination. So Go for it. Yes, ma'am.
Sometimes I break it down based off of sometimes I break it down based off of not even years, but like I've had experience in X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
Like I teach a professional development course, so I talk about like those specific types of things or share some of my own experiences. And after my first 8 weeks of teaching, I did that the second 8 weeks, so I got a lot less of that. Like she doesn't know what she's talking about feedback. So I don't know if that would help. Like I don't know if they just thought because I was young that I hadn't had experiences yet, but once I kind of shared that with my new group, it felt like it wasn't as much of a question of authority there.
Oddly, the more humble you are about your credentials, usually the better it's taken. Jack.
Something I found that's always effective is that if you have to address something along the lines of what we're talking about here with your situation, is that you couch it in terms of socialization. Part of your role as an instructor is to appropriately socialize your students to the type of environment that they're going to be in. And you know, you don't want to come out and say, well, you know, I blame your mama because you got no respect. But you know,
That's a socialization issue as well, because there should be dual parenting when there's a possibility of it.
yes, but that was told to me back in the late 1990s. Before these things were even issues. But I mean, you see the point. You don't have to come at it that hard, but you do have to, you can couch it in language such as, you know, I don't appreciate, I personally don't feel as though you addressing me by my first name, uninvited, is unacceptable, but other people are going to feel that way and they're not going to be nearly as nice about it as I am. So it's not appropriate to do this unless you have been invited. And that's just one example that is common among, especially undergraduates. They feel like, oh, I'm chummy with, I like that word chummy. I can be chummy with this person. I did have one student, and you know this story too, I did have that one student who, when he received his grade, said, "A D, come on, bro."
And the other twist on what Dr. Turner is describing is that sometimes there's an elegant way to put the problem back on the person who is guilty. If you said in that scenario, I am so sorry, since we're in kind of a public place, would you mind calling me Dr. So-and-so, because I look young and so I'm constantly fighting this battle of people just assuming that I'm their agent. And they're like, oh yeah, you've just explained to them what the problem is without accusing them of it. And so that, again, as we're trying to be respectful in the way that we do without a power struggle, maybe that can help accomplish it.
There's one last question.
Yes.
I was just going to say, based off of that, I think making these
Go ahead, project that way a little bit too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Making these expectations explicit in the syllabus allows you to always default to it, and you can have in there, for student conduct, that professionalism is an expectation you have of everyone. You can have a discussion first day about some of those things that it means. But then when you try to enforce it with a specific student, it could also be about the idea of fairness, or that you need all students to treat you in a similar way, so that way you're not giving special treatment to any specific ones. For instance, in one of my classes, I had a student that was very, very chummy with me before or after class, so I knew that he felt very comfortable with me. And on an assignment, instead of putting my name on the assignment, he put Piano Goddess, spelled incorrectly at that. Which I now have on a mug. I was able to say to him that I appreciate that you feel very comfortable around me, and I want you to feel very comfortable around me, but at the same time I need you to be addressing me with the sort of professionalism that we talked about, because I'm requesting that of everyone. So that way I could let him still feel special, but be but you're not.
Yeah. And Piano Goddess is an interesting Goddess.
Oh, nice.
Even if you had to say, during the time that I'm your TA, I'm so-and-so, that role may change. And if at that point I'm, your piano goddess, that's fine. But in this role, in this 4 months, there's a difference. So what happens on our campus? In this last year, 884 reports of violations. Not all of them is there enough information to say that there's a violation. So what's the difference? If you're not sure, what's your decision point as to whether or not to submit a report? What if you're not sure? What do you think?
I think if I have any question, it wouldn't hurt to report it because it's not my job to investigate, it's just to report.
Exactly. We want to do everything we can to take you out of any role of guilt of, oh, I don't want to be the decision maker. You're not. Bing! Here's some pixie dust. You don't have to be the decision maker, which is exactly where you want to be because you're the ones that have to maintain that relationship with the student for the rest. And again, have to be able to academically evaluate them without the idea of, I'm also investigating you for an academic integrity violation. So it is critical to us. And you'll see 79% of the reports had a violation of responsible, or there's evidence here that it could have been, so we're still going to address it. When it comes to that last percentage that weren't in violation, here's the thing. It's about the information that supports the allegation. So sometimes we think something happened, but guess what? Fairness is an integral component of this. So if we can't prove it, then the student shouldn't have a violation. And some people go, well, that's pretty invalidating for an instructor. I understand that feeling. However, if that center percentage was 100%, then I am the crap bag in the room. Because I'm saying anybody who alleges, it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what the evidence says, we're just gonna find you in violation. Well, that's not fair. Where's the education in that? If we go back to academic integrity or any violation of that undermines our intention, yeah, we're teaching about it. We're helping students hone their skills. We're not just saying, hey, even though an instructor has more credibility in almost any case, just because an instructor says so does not mean that it's automatic. We're gonna analyze every single fact we have. And sometimes we just can't find the computer address that shows that it came from that person. But if you are that student in that situation and you did do it, but we can't prove it, is it possible that you learned something through being called out? I learn a lot. If I'm doodling in a workshop and somebody calls on me, I'm like, my heart's like this, you know? I mean, it does not take much and it doesn't have to be so overt. So just the process alone is also meant to be very educational, regardless of what the outcome is. Was there a question? Yes.
What's FIO?
For information only. So sometimes if we're working on the preponderance of evidence standards, it means is it more likely than not that something happened? But sometimes it's just over and there's an extenuating circumstance. So for example, we have a senior who joined a GroupMe chat and someone sent out, here's where you can find some of the test answers. We can show that that person opened that GroupMe message. We'll never know whether they used the test answers, but they could have redistributed it too. So we have a problem. That is a complicity honor code issue, but they're gonna graduate in 2 weeks. So we have an extenuating circumstance and we have right on the line of the evidence. So some cases, because this is behavioral, get a little bit sticky and we're like, what's the best thing? Do we put this on a permanent record if she's going to medical school when this was a very in the weeds complex case? Or do we say, we want you to complete this workshop and get the education that was intended from this experience, but we're not gonna put it on your record for the long term? That's the most complex answer I could ever give to a very simple question. And 14 days to resolution, many of them take 2 to 3. Some of them are very, very, very complicated. And we're asking our Blackboard tech folks to go back in and look at this. And the research on it takes a long time. If somebody is smoking weed, it smells like they're smoking weed. You go there and, there's paraphernalia, very straightforward. Academic integrity rarely happens that way unless we have two tests that are identical. We have a safe assign that's 100%. The evidence is much more complex. So that's when it can take 14 days, but we don't sit on anything. We know it's stressful for you in the interim. We know it's stressful for the student in the interim. And we're keeping you updated with, this is when that student has their first appointment and this is when we're finished. Because we know that in that time frame in between, you can't help but feel a little bit weird. I wish you didn't have to, but you can't help but go, I wonder what's happening. Yes, sir.
Like for safe aside, usually I say if more than 20%, if the safe assign is more than 20%, then we're gonna have to move this along and just, is that helpful to deal with it?
I think it's always helpful to let students know what your baseline is. Most of what and it also depends on whether it's a lab report or not. A lab report is going to be much higher on the likeness scale. We get 80% when we don't have a plagiarism issue because the context of a lab report is the same. Or the structure, of the lab report is the same. 20% is a pretty low threshold, but I'd love it for all of them to be 0. So yeah, I think saying this is what raises a suspicion, and so I want to make sure that we vet every time that there's a suspicion, and I hand that over to the folks whose job it is to do it. So do you have an opinion on?
Yeah, and I would say too, there's always going to be something that's going to be flagged in a person's report if there was the requirement that they utilize outside sources, right? So citations will be flagged because those citations are out there on the internet. So I think if you're questioning it when it comes to a safe assign report, that's something that you can send to our office and we can review. We can always call. You can call, we can talk through what you should do, how you might want to address it, and that way we can give you that kind of support right when it's happening. I would say 20 is kind of like a low, so but it depends on your discipline. I think more often than not, it's like 35%, because the percentages also all mean very different things. You can have a whole paper that maybe up at the top says only about 20% is flagged in the paper, but then when you look at the breakdown of in comparison, you can have, maybe it's just 20%, but it's like 100% matches. So that's where knowing how to read the safe assign sometimes can be helpful. And one other thing that can be both a preventative tool and in a way with safe assign is you can allow students to submit and see their safe assign report. And so turning on that feature can be helpful. Now, of course, educate them on how it needs to be read so they don't freak out if they see I have 20% because of their citations. But that can be a helpful way to help them see, especially if you're in a writing course or they're doing research for the first time in your class, that can be helpful to help them learn some of those skills. For time purposes, I do want to move us forward because because I want to make sure we can get through a lot of the content. So these are some of the trends that we are seeing, and some of them we have talked a little bit about in some of our prior conversations. Some of the things that we're seeing that I think are important, so Elisa mentioned GroupMe. How many of you are familiar with GroupMe as an application? Okay, good, excellent. So I think being able to have conversations with your fellow faculty about how you're handling these types of messaging apps and social media, text message communication in the classroom can be really helpful. It just helps make sure everybody is aware and understands kind of the nature and how our students are learning and communicating with one another. With GroupMe in particular, the last 2 or 3 semesters, we've seen a consistent number of cases that are coming to us from that application. So we were talking about a large scale number of individuals, 100 or so, that are in a big class. One of the best things to make sure if you teach a large class, there is a GroupMe. Even if you teach a class of 40 students, there's probably a class GroupMe. Share with them that you know what it is and that you need to either to know about it or ask to be a part of it. It's up to you what you would like to do. and how you want to be involved in it or not, but you just need to be aware that it's there. And they need to know that too. That goes back to like when there is anonymity, it breeds some of these more negative behaviors and kind of creates a culture where it's cool to use the class group me to ask people to sign them in and say that you'll pay them for signing you in or whatever. It just kind of makes that behavior really negative. Yeah.
I want to say that I think I've seen faculty members get into trouble becoming part of their students' group, because then there's a level of informality that sometimes
Sure.
takes place there. That I'm like, yeah, that's why I don't talk to them.
And that's, I think, that's a decision point that you have to make, right? Of whether or not you want to join it or not. But I think that it's very critical to say, I know that you guys are going to use this, and I would like to help structure it in a way that it is actually meant for its intended purposes, right? So if the purpose of the class group me is, you know, note sharing, catching up if you had to be out or things like that, which is often the case, you know, you talk at the beginning about what are the expectations for this, right? How are we gonna, what is okay in terms of how we share notes in this class? What isn't okay to do in this group? It is not okay for you to post test questions or ask information related to quizzes or tests. It's not okay for you to ask people to sign you in using this application. So kind of walking through some of the things that, and setting the expectations for how they use it, if you're not comfortable being a part of it. Because that way they just hopefully stick to. And then also knowing that, you know, okay, if you're in this class group me and something like that does happen and you don't share it, that violates my trust, violates what I feel you know, is our complicity policy, like Elisa mentioned. And so knowing how to address that if that does happen can help. We've seen more of those high-performing students or students in a professional program being reported to our office. Oftentimes that is related back to the pressures, sometimes that internal pressure. There may be some external pressure coming with those particular students, but a lot of times it's that internal. So same thing to apply with that is that building some consistent practices for failure there. We do have a fairly low recidivism rate with if we look at our data and statistics within a 5-year time span, we have about an 8% recidivism rate. So students that are reported to us more than one time. Meaning most of the time, if you report a student, it's gonna be their first time being reported, which can be a helpful thing to think about in the back of your mind to know how to best address it with them. But it can also be helpful to know that how we respond to that is educational in nature. It can also help is when if you report them and you don't see kind of what our standard first time outcomes are, you can kind of read between the lines that, you know, there was something else that we needed to do, but that we might not necessarily disclose directly with you. One other thing I want to talk a little bit about, because this was mentioned in the online forum, is that kind of other students doing writing papers or academic work. And we talked a little bit about this in our prior session, but there are some really good guidelines to help combat this particular issue. So whether this is I'm asking a friend to work on writing a paper for me, or I'm actually going out to the internet and buying a paper, there are a lot of those types of websites. So specifically looking at calling it either ghostwriting or contract cheating, those are some of the things that we see. And there's a great article that talks a little bit about how to address this that I will make sure that I share with Xavier so that it can get out to you all. But that's where knowing your student's voice, setting up multiple writing assignments and deadlines for those writing assignments can help combat some of that. When you think that it's happening, it can be a challenging thing to prove, but that's a good reason to be sharing, calling our office, having us talk through what are some of the things that we can look for. Because sometimes it's as simple as seeing, well, who was the original author on the paper? There's you know, and sometimes they get it and it doesn't say their name, it says someone else's name. So there's sometimes some small things that we can do to try to combat that particular issue, and other times it really has to be us sitting down and having that conversation and say, hey, this particular phrase is unlike stuff you've written in the past. What do you mean by that? Is that a 100% sure way that we know that that person had someone else write their work? No. But does it at least clue that person into somebody is really concerned? Yeah. And maybe they would think twice about doing it again, even if there isn't enough evidence to say that they are responsible for doing that. So definitely on some of those more complex issues, feel free to reach out to us because those are kind of pretty difficult ones to diagnose and know what you're looking for and how to address and handle them. A couple other things, we talked the unauthorized collaboration. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, in the last slide, can you speak to the self-efficacy
sure.
issue just a little bit? Because I noticed that particularly this spring semester and trying to build in a couple of things to do in my class because I feel this sort of victim language around a lot of what they're doing. It's almost like they feel like they have no control in their own success. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so yes, that does happen. So the students, but particularly those that have a low sense of self-efficacy are struggling a lot with taking some also ownership over their education. So some of it is talking to them about what are their responsibilities in this class. So we talked a little bit about Generation Z before, and this is a transition for any student coming from high school to college. They're having to learn how to be an adult, and we know the concept of adulting is now a thing that people are trying to avoid, and you can't. You do have to take that ownership. So talking a little bit about what are their academic responsibilities with each one of the assignments that you do. So helping to break it down, because breaking it down for them makes it feel more manageable. It makes it approachable. It makes it less scary. Whereas if all you have to do is say, talk about an adulting thing is like finances, right? Like that you have to pay bills and, manage, know how much money's in your bank account and not bounce. So being able to kind of talk about, okay, helping them build a budget, perhaps no one ever did that for them before. So it's like building them, step-by-step instructions on kind of what to do there. And again, some people can say that that's spoon-feeding the answers to them, or you can really go with the strategy of that's actually giving them the tools to do it well. And so that's really kind of what they need for that. Some of that can go into also how you build up those assignments. So you were talking earlier about how you give them an assignment, they do it, and then they get the chance to redo it. And that's a way to increase their self-efficacy, for sure.
Can I add something to that, Erin?
Yeah.
Also, what we find in the world of behavioral intervention is this term called the warm handoff. And if I say to Sam, Sam, I think you'd really benefit from the Writing Center because they can help you, with some of the disjointedness in your paper. Well, Sam probably already knew that, maybe not, but he's like, okay, great. At the point where I invite Sam to the office, show him the website, call and make an appointment with him, that is a warm handoff. What they find are, in many cases, there's like a 70% more likelihood that the person gets to whatever the service is. And so what that tells us is what's between that student with low self-efficacy and what they need, which is here, free, and available, agency. Okay, well, I can't give them agency, but I can do a warm handoff, especially for goodness sake. I mean, if we're in this building and we know that student success is, or you're so close, do you want to walk over? Let me know how you're doing, what else is going on in your life. A warm handoff can solve everything for your student for the next 3 years. Everything. Everything is a gross overstatement, by the way.
Some of the other things that we see a little bit is that, again, that technology piece coming into consideration with cheating in the classroom. So using cell phones during testing and everything, that can be one major thing. The group me components, that stuff. Unauthorized collaborations, I mentioned this a little bit before. Again, helping students to know, ask your partner how they got the answer, not what the answer is, and re-explaining that in multiple ways can help with that collaborative piece. Our plagiarism spectrum, knowing that it really runs the gamut. In my mind, a student is always going to come to you and say, well, that was a mistake. It was accidental, so I didn't violate the policy. When we actually look at our plagiarism policy, their intent has nothing to do with it. So as an educator, I'm not wanting to play gotcha when it was probably mistake oriented. I'm wanting to dive deeper and debrief in that mistake. It's great when somebody says, okay, yeah, I made those mistakes or errors. They're admitting that they did not do things well or right. That means it's not a lack of knowledge issue, it's a decision-making issue. And we can dive deep into how you make decisions in that appointment that we have with you and talking about the honor code. I love doing that part of it so much more sometimes than just like well, no, it's not, it's a knowledge issue now at this point. We can do both, but the decision-making one, that's our bread and butter, and that's more oftentimes what we're seeing is a problem with students than the I didn't know. But if it is a I didn't know, I still encourage you to report it to our office because you don't know if they have said that before. It's not likely, but it's possible. But it's also one of those things, if they keep saying it to you and then to the next professor and the next professor, and we all keep believing it, we're just reinforcing that they don't really have to learn because no one's given them actual consequences. So we're going to talk about kind of the 4 different policies, the common behaviors, and kind of ways that people can respond to it. With the cheating policy, what do you guys feel is probably what is most concerning to you about some of these common behaviors, and maybe why might you not want to intervene?
I'm sorry, ask that again.
So why might you not want to intervene if it's like a test cheating behavior?
It's going to disrupt other students.
So concern it may disrupt others.
I think, for example, like I was talking about the international student,
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned an international student cheating situation earlier where it was, well, I would have perceived it as cheating and they were using a translating system. I'm now calling that student out not only on potentially cheating, but also having to translate English into their first language. So that's kind of a fine line to balance as well.
So we're really, which is, you guys are thinking about how am I going to impact this individual or the other people in that particular space. I would say that there are different ways and that you can combat these particular issues in your class and different ways that you can address it. So you can take a direct approach if you would like, or if you're uncomfortable with that, there can be a different way. So if you see cell phone cheating happening in your class and you're uncomfortable with moving up, asking that person, hey, can I have your phone? Keeping a monitoring eye on that individual, looking at when you started noticing that behavior happening in terms of timing, and then again, circulating around that particular person in the room. One of the things that I will say can be hard to respond to, at least from our office's lens, send those students to us because we can have the conversation about why are you having a phone in the first place, right? That's pretty standard that you shouldn't even have one, while you're taking an exam. So let's break that down first. Sometimes it gets to be difficult in those situations though, of did they actually use that phone for an academic advantage, which is a part of what our code says. So that's where if you do feel comfortable intervening, asking to take the phone or asking to see what's on the phone, it can help kind of clear up that particular issue. Well, it may be a short distraction. Is it probably also equally distracting for the people sitting around them seeing this person on their phone the whole time? Yeah, it is. So I think it can be okay to say, can I take this for later? And then have that conversation. That doesn't make too much of a distraction. Yeah.
At what point would you, so in my class, we have a final exam, there's no other testing throughout the semester. At what point during that final exam, if you're seeing a student on their phone consistently, do you walk up and say, you're done, I need your exam and you're dismissed from the course, or
So that can be one option. You can tell the student that, I'm taking, your test, you are finished for the day because I saw you on your phone. That can be one option. I think another option, and perhaps a better one, is, to say, I'm going to take that test. I've seen you use your phone. Can I also have that? And I'm going to give you a new one. And that way, they can start from wherever it is that they left off, but you at least know from wherever it is that they were, if they were on question 20 of 50, that questions 21 through 50, there was no problem. Giving them the option to kind of continue or redo may end up being helpful in the event that maybe there was some other kind of issue and we can't necessarily say that they did cheat. I think that same thing goes for, and can be helpful if you think that two students are talking with one another back and forth during an examination. Again, kind of asking to take the exam, giving them some new ones, still gives the opportunity. Now, all of those are perfect. Like, you can say that they are finished with taking the test. That's a little bit more of a, I don't want to say aggressive because that seems negative, but that's a pretty strict way of handling it.
Question for you.
Sure.
We have a lot of international students, and sometimes our terminology doesn't suit their terminology, so they don't understand, and they're trying to translate it with the telephone. I've had that, and I had to say, telephones. And they come up to you afterwards in tears saying, I just don't understand it this way. What's the best way to handle it?
So if people have questions about understanding the actual question that you're testing, the best way to handle it for, a domestic student or an international student is say, if you don't understand the question, raise your hand. That is the best way to address questions, because then you can go out there and you can say, what don't you understand about the question? I need it to be worded in a different way. You can rephrase how the question is, and it still helps them get that information. So that's really going to be the best way to address it, is helping them know how to ask questions, right? So if you have to talk during the exam, I don't know why you would have to talk during the exam, but if for some reason there's a problem or you feel the need to talk, raise your hand, talk to me. Sometimes there is maybe something that we don't know that's going on with that particular student, and they don't feel comfortable enough to disclose that. So they may be having some kind of medical issue, whatever it is, or a family emergency kind of thing. And so what I try to tell students is, tell me before why you might need to have your phone with you, because maybe mom or sister or whomever is counting on you to be their caretaker that day, and while you're taking the test. Tell me before, don't tell me after, because that's when we have the problem. So a couple things you can do also with if you're sharing collaboration or sharing these issues with us, I would say if you see odd similarities in a student's test or in their homework assignments, highlighting those, helping us to see kind of why they might be similar. Same thing with, it also helps that student see, gosh, we did word for word say this, answer this question in the exact same way. And guess what? Nobody else in the class was reported, so you sat next to one another, it was word for word the same. It's more likely than not that you guys cheated, right? So it helps us kind of know some of those different things. Our plagiarism policy, ways to respond to some of these different issues. We talked a little bit about this when you guys had some questions, so I won't dwell too much, but specifically when we look at that ghostwriting, some of the things that I do is I just Google what the odd phrases are. Chances are something may pop up, and that helps us kind of better understand. It may be that they just didn't paraphrase it well, too. It might not be that somebody else actually did write it for them, but that they just poorly paraphrased. Yeah.
Excuse me, since I am international students, I want to mention this, and I'm putting my cases now. The plagiarism issue, it is and exists in our countries.
Right.
To be honest, I'm from Iraq, I don't know about others, but we don't have this.
Right.
Just copy paste, take it. And so the international students, they need to be aware about plagiarism, and they need to be teach different ways how to get rid of this. When I'm putting my thesis right now, I write in the notes, I love mention real situations and how we deal with these situations. I try rephrase the sentences, but it does not look the way that it's originally published.
Right.
From the original document, how I take it. So, and my mentor keeps saying your grammar is not good, or rephrase this, or do whatever. So I think that the university need to be aware about this, and with the international students, and need to teach them ways how to be good and rephrasing and get rid of plagiarism. Ways to check, like for example, the Grammarly.
Right.
The Grammarly, it's a website, it's free, you can download, and you can also check the plagiarism. So, this, I think it's a very important point to take care of.
I agree with you. Yeah, the cultural difference is very, it's not, this is a very it's a very Americanized thing where we have to give people credit for their ideas. And so
I did. Of course, I mentioned the reference, and I put the reference in a very correct way. But still, since it is, I don't rephrase it in the right way. I need to change more than one word. I need to change the tense. Still.
No, I agree. I think that's one of the things where it can be helpful when you're working with your students, especially if you see somebody, and Shelley, you've got good strategies for a lot of this too, based on what you do. You're wanting to help students know how do we do some exercises that may build up your ability to paraphrase, right? So the Purdue OWL has some good exercises they have on their website. So perhaps before they have to write their first paper, it's saying, let's do an in-class exercise about paraphrasing. When I go and I teach some of the different student classes that I do, that's one of the things that we do. And now we don't take too much time to do it, right? It's a short paraphrasing activity. I give them about 5 minutes to work on how they paraphrase. And our conversation is not so much, well, tell me, what did you write? It's, tell me, what was your process? How was this difficult? Did you struggle? And why did you struggle? What were some things that you can learn from your peers about maybe why it was a little bit easier for them, or a strategy that they used? So some of it is just kind of taking some time to break down how to do this and not making the assumption that we all know how to paraphrase properly, or how to cite things in the best way. And so that's kind of one of the strategies that can be used in the classroom is teaching some of that. Or setting up times for specific office hours or directing people to utilize the writing center. Those can be some ways that help you manage some of that too, if you aren't feeling like you can use direct class time towards some of that. I would argue if you're teaching a writing course or they have to do a research paper, it should be something that's discussed. So in terms of the falsification, again, I mentioned attendance documentation being one of the most typical ones that we see. So utilize those different multiple strategies. When you do see something like if you just have it, it's just signing people in, like if it's just a list, make sure that you cycle back through that list at the end of class. Do two, perhaps you can do 2 lists. That can be one way to kind of work through that. And one of the bigger things that can be more challenging to discuss is kind of some of those, you think the student is lying to you, they said they were, they missed class for, a doctor or whatnot. Then gather your information, document things. Those are gonna be ways that we can then help you kind of try to address these issues as well. So with the lying behaviors, we're getting into like a moral issue and concern, where some of these also are, but some of those more so are. And so that's where students can feel somewhat personally, it's more personal if you kind of have to accuse somebody of lying. So trying to take out some of that emotion, and that's why documenting the different behaviors can be a good way to do that. And then the last one, that complicity. So submitting assignments through SafeAssign can be helpful. Reporting both students if you feel like somebody has, taken information from another student. It's important to report both of those individuals. Will the outcome look the exact same for the person who took someone else's academic work than the person who gave the academic work? It will look a little bit different. One is more culpable than the other, and that's a conversation that we have. But the other issue that we come across is people not reporting. And so talking to your students about the importance of reporting issues and why they might want to do it. It's not just that, because they could also find themselves in trouble, that they should be reporting information to our office, right? It really should be more of that internal motivation of you should report others, because we want this to be a positive academic space in which you are getting the best degree possible. Okay. We're gonna skip that and then kind of really just talk a little bit more about how to respond. So I do encourage you all, if you feel comfortable, to have a conversation with a student that you have to report. You don't have to discuss the concern in detail. And I think one of the best ways to frame it is to say, I am obligated to report this to the Office of Academic Integrity. They're there to be an unbiased individual, to just look at what happened, hear from you as a student and me as the faculty member to figure out if a policy was violated, right? So frame it in a set of mind of that this is a process that's for them just as much as it is there to help you. If you do choose to discuss the concern, tell the student, I don't want to hear, I don't want to, say, I'm here to just tell you what my concerns are, again, because I'm not the fact finder in this process. You don't necessarily have to disclose to me what happened or why. I just want you to know what my concerns were. And then explain a little bit about our process. That all of those can be just helpful ways to kind of get that student feeling a little less anxious, perhaps, about the process, and helping them feel a little bit more comfortable. Because if you can imagine, they feel like you telling them that they cheated means that they must have done it. And if they don't feel like they did, that can be really hard. It may also make them think that they're going to be kicked out of the institution. And again, 9 times out of 10 on a first offense, that's not how we're going to address these issues. It is much more educational in nature, where we're going to have students do basically a decision-making or academic integrity workshop, where they look at all of these kind of reasons behind why they may have cheated and how they can avoid it in the future, as well as placing them on a probationary period. And that may be in addition to whatever grade penalty that you might feel you want to assess.
And I would add that in most cases, these go well, and our
Yes.
faculty members tell us that it goes well, because as we know, if you find out you're getting an email from the Office of Academic Integrity and you're 20 years old, you start catastrophizing, or many of our students do. Oh my God, this is the end. But if your faculty member takes the time to say, because you're SafeAssign and this came up with this, I have to report this, they're gonna send an email to you, and then they're gonna call you and ask you about what happened. So it is much more awkward if you're like, oh, I just don't wanna have this conversation. They get something from the Office of Academic Integrity that says, can you please come on Tuesday at 3:30 because we wanna ask you about what happened in sociology 2 whatever. And they're like, well, that's weird. He never even talked to me about it. Which, again, not an unreasonable thought. Well, why didn't she talk to me about it? So now that could be another jumping off point for catastrophizing. They don't like me, they didn't. Who knows? But saying, here's what happened. Someone in my position, no matter who it is at the school, is gonna say, hey, this is enough that somebody else who's an unbiased person and is not in this class is gonna take a look at it. Then they're gonna make a determination. If you want me to go to that meeting too, if you want whatever, I'm happy to, but they're gonna send you an email. So just be looking out for that. And usually this is resolved within how many days?
14.
Yeah.
And they may also, a large portion of our students do come in and accept responsibility for their
Yes.
actions. So it's more likely that your student is going to understand, accept some kind of responsibility, And they may do that in a couple different ways, right? They may not always get defensive in their conversation with you. They may shut down. They may not be very talkative. They may say, yes, I just understand, right? Or they may cry. But those are all like very appropriate emotions to have when you're faced with some type of failure. I will say if you're not feeling comfortable in having a face-to-face conversation with the student, we do have a sample email that you can use and send out that kind of covers a lot of these same things and still is an excellent way to help that student not feel overly blindsided about the situation. So we have two short case studies. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I just have a quick question.
Uh-huh.
So I know that not just faculty report, but also students and even community members can report.
Uh-huh.
If there is something that has occurred, say, in my class,
Yeah.
but someone else reports it, would I be told?
Absolutely. We're gonna loop you in because you might know something about it, or maybe don't, but you can help us like better understand the issue. So we want the context in your kind of voice involved in that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I might be getting to this, but in terms of the grade penalty, do you have any recommendations about if we're pretty certain that, say, a case of plagiarism or some sort of cheating happened on an assignment or an assessment, what should we wait for the ruling before we grade entirely? How would you?
Yeah, so I do think it's best to wait, right? Now, if the student comes in, say you do this, you have this meeting, and the student comes in and they're like, yeah, I did this. I did cheat on my test. It's okay, I think at that point to let them know, hey, if you're comfortable, I'm gonna go ahead and issue this grade penalty. This is what my typical grade penalty is. The reason why I say it's best to wait, especially if that student has kind of like denied any of the cheating, is because it feels like a decision's already been made if you do issue a grade penalty, right? So from that student's perspective, they think, okay, well, this faculty member has already made up their mind. They're going to issue this grade penalty, and they're not willing to let this process play out. So most often, it's best, in my opinion, to wait for any type of grade penalty. And I recognize that at an end of a semester, that can be tough because you start to get some nasty grams from the registrar's office that says like, hey, you haven't done this. Ignore it. We've talked to them about that. We send them your name. We say like, hey, these are the people where stuff is outstanding. And we also do try to, especially at the end of the semester, not as heavy in December, but in May, we do try to look at and triage okay, these people are seniors. They're graduating seniors. Let's make sure that we try to address these issues as quick as we possibly can.
Could you possibly give us language to use in situations like this where the student cheated, you know the student cheated, the student admits they've cheated, but they have come to your office to try to convince you to retract the accusation, and then when that doesn't work, to try to wheedle, manipulate, whatever you want to call it, you into giving them another chance to write something to replace the thing that they screwed up.
Yeah. So I think one of the best things is going back to that syllabus policy. So if you, in your academic integrity section of your syllabus, if you have kind of what your standards are, what you don't, what your grade penalty is, all of those are things that then you can pull that back out when that student's trying to do that and say, this is what I've written in the contract. And I shared this with you from the very beginning. If I were to make exceptions to this, that would be unfair to all of the other students in this course. And that all of the other students in the class, to me, is always my meter, right, of what is fair and what's the right thing to do. I can be empathetic and understand that these consequences are going to have a significant, are going to have an impact on that student. So I can say, I understand that this is going to be hard, that you're failing this class. Let's think about what are some ways that we can address that, because it's not going to change, because it's not fair to the other students in this class. So that's where you can kind of say, have you thought about talking to your academic advisor? And doing that warm handoff of like, should we try to go and meet with them or someone from the UAC right now, showing them how to make those appointments, the University Advising Center, That can be a helpful tool. I think it's also okay for you, if a lot of those strategies don't work, for you to say, we have exhausted this conversation. And I've shared with you my syllabus, I've shared with you what my standards are, and I don't feel like it's productive for us to continue the conversation. If you feel like you are being graded unfairly, there's a process for that. That's the grade grievance process. You'll need to speak with my department chair. Because that's where that sometimes there is somebody that is that pushy and or
Yeah.
manipulative, right?
Yeah.
And that's where you can say, enough is enough. Let me use the next resource at my disposal. So it's kind of figuring out what's that person's motivator for doing that. And sometimes that's the route you have to go. The other times, they've never heard of academic forgiveness, and you can just help them know that that's a possibility still. So that scholarship that they were looking to keep, they still potentially have the opportunity to keep.
You can also reference 3 and then just say it in a Shakespearean way, that academic dishonesty undermines the fundamental goals of education. But, I mean, I believe that to my core, so that's a delivery that you probably could execute beautifully. And what we find in students who really are the least able to kind of reach those coping mechanisms is that something shuts them down. And how do we measure resiliency? Your ability to bounce back from some sort of adversity. And sometimes it is a matter of, and again, this is a big time you being the bigger person, it's coaching them into, okay, the bottom fell out. What's your biggest fear about this? Telling your parents? Okay, let's practice what you're gonna say to your parents. What's the likelihood that you have had any component of reporting something that's going to make them have to leave the institution is about this big. There would have to be so many other decisions that they had made. You know that, I know that, but sometimes they just need someone to walk them through. Okay, you didn't want to take a Maymester? What will it mean for you to take a Maymester, and how do you talk about that? They just need somebody to slide the window open this big and say, I know this isn't what you want to talk about because you don't want this to happen, but you need somebody to problem solve with you right now. So let's problem solve. You're taking the focus, you're deflecting now. You're taking the focus off of you and what your responsibility is, because you don't have responsibility, and saying, fix it, and you're going to be less riddled with anxiety about the bottom falling out, because it's not going to. There's just a different solution than what you had planned.
Yeah, thinking about plan B is really what you're having to happen. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring up that might address the first part of the question that you had asked is about what do you do when a student comes and wants you to, give them a second chance and not make the report. One thing that I always encouraged my adjunct instructors to do was to have both the report and the meeting with the person loaded and ready to go. Right before they get there for the meeting, that's when you make the report. And when you make the report, that bird's gone, it can't be brought back. And that's just what you tell them, that bird's gone, it can't be brought back. I can't undo that. The process has to play out. I would also, and I know that's different from what you said, Erin.
But that's a good strategy, right? If you know yourself you tend to be overly empathetic to the point where you may not hold somebody accountable. That's a good strategy of submit the report, then share this, that's gonna happen, that they are gonna have to come and meet with us, because that helps hold you accountable.
Right.
How long is it from when we submit that report to when the student gets notified?
So it's probably gonna be maybe most of the time. Now this depends on how heavy the semester, heavy things are at that point in the semester. But I look at those reports daily, so it's gonna be opened up within most likely 1 or 2 days, and then we'll most likely be able to share that back out with the student at that time. So typically, by the time when you report it to when the student is notified, it's gonna be 2 days, maybe a little more than that, depending on how busy we are. Because of course, the time in which we're getting a lot of reports is also the same time in which we're having to meet with a lot of students. So having to balance those, but typically 1 to 2 business days. yeah, I don't check my email or on the weekend.
We are out of time.
We are out of time. So we can perhaps use some
We'll
of these.
stay late.
Yeah, and to answer any questions and use some strategies later.
Well, thanks to both of our presenters again. It was a very